Thank you very much for the invitation, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I know the work of the Hot Politics Lab, and I follow that, so it's really an honor to be able to present here. And I have to say, from all the different projects that I work on that are kind of relevant, maybe I chose the riskiest one, because it's, first of all, the first time we're presenting that ever, and also it's a bit of a speculative project connecting some literatures that we think there is a promise in there, but I would really like to hear whether you find this interesting and stimulating. If not, we can also talk about effective polarization, political ideology, European integration, migration, or any other of the topics that I work. COVID policy, we just published a paper on excess mortality in the Netherlands with some epidemiologists, very exciting findings, but maybe later. What I really want to talk today about is causal motivated reasoning or motivated causal reasoning. And this is, as I said, ongoing work with Honorata. We have some data, but it's really the first version that we're presenting ever. Now, to start with not such a pretty picture, unfortunately, this is the initial motivation for this project. And this is a picture from 2 years ago from Ukraine, from Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. And it's one of the hospitals that they bombed. So what spurred interest to this topic to me was the idea, okay, so how can humans commit such atrocities on the one hand, but then when you read the comments to this event, it was immediately clear that people tried to justify that, oh, but there were soldiers hiding there, so it was a legitimate target. And of course, this didn't quite fly with Ukrainians and supporters of Ukraine, but it made me think, okay, what if the parties were reversed? Would we buy this argument more if they are against the sides that we endorse, we like, or our side, or not? So how flexible is the human mind, in finding justifications for such atrocities? So I don't know what happened. Yeah, I think this flickering, I'm not the only one seeing that, right?
No.
I'm a bit nervous, but I think I'm done.
I don't know what it could be.
Okay, I hope it's not too distracting.
The computer is also becoming more emotional.
Yeah. No, it's I mean, on the one hand, really sad motivation. On the other hand, I think to understand human behavior, we also need to look into cases like that. So the main idea is, in order for people to form judgments about blame, who is to blame and who is to whose responsibility it is, then we need causal judgment. So people react to those things by forming causal judgments about who did what, perhaps why, and based on that, they form opinions about responsibilities and about who is to blame. But then we know from literature, and I'm going to go into that in a while, that causal judgments are just tricky. And especially when events are caused by multiple causes, which is almost always the case, when there are omissions involved or when there's prevention involved. So in such situations, we are not very good in making clear, unambiguous causal judgments. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, we also know, and you know better than me, that motivated reasoning plays a big part in how we form our judgments, how we search for information, how we interpret information. So the main idea is to these things connect in the sense that does motivated reasoning extend to causal judgments? And causal judgments, again, are important because they're the basis of judgments we make about blame and responsibility, which has a lot to do with politics. Now, what is this causal judgment about? Causal judgment is about how do people form judgments about causal relationships in the world and decide about the causes of events. Now, I'm sure you're all following courses on causal inference, or maybe, and this is a little bit different because the causal inference literature in the social sciences and beyond that deals with the question what causality really is and how we can study that. Well, this literature is about how normal people think about the causes of events. So these literatures are related, but they are separate. So what I'm going to talk about are insights from the literature in experimental philosophy or cognitive science that studies how real people form judgments about what is a causal effect and what is not a causal effect. So there are a few insights from this literature that I want to share. First of all, that in situations of multiple causation, which are the vast majority of situations, people vary in what they consider to be a cause. So they privilege some factors over others. So if you think about what led to the win of Trump in the presidential elections just a few weeks ago, then any particular state contributes to the win, but we're all going to have maybe different opinions about which state was really the most important for Trump to win the election and why. So this literature tries to tap into people's intuitions about what we consider a cause and why. So a very simple and popular example in this literature is when we have a fire in a forest, and this forest fire was because of a lit match. We usually say that the fire happened, it was caused by the lit match and not by the presence of oxygen, although, strictly speaking, the presence of oxygen is just as necessary for the fire to occur as is a match that is lit. So we privilege some causal factors over others, and the question is why? Not only that, this literature has discovered that we're not thinking about causes in the sense of something is a cause or is definitely not a cause. Causal judgments are graded, meaning that we assign different levels of causal power to different factors in situations of multiple causation. And then the question comes, if we assign different causal power to different factors, how do we decide on which factors to assign higher causal power? And some of the leading models in this literature say that we assign higher causal power to causes that are portable. I'm going to explain what that means. Portable means that these causes, these factors generalize across a range of counterfactual scenarios. So there are several models in this literature that try to explain, provide comprehensive theories about how people form causal judgments. The most prominent ones are based on a counterfactual reasoning. So the idea is that people, when you try to decide whether something is a cause or not, you create counterfactual scenarios in your mind, and then you sample from those. When you sample from these counterfactual scenarios, implicitly, it doesn't need to be something that you do with pen and paper, obviously, but then a cause is something that across pairs of counterfactual scenarios in which only the cause changes, it makes a difference for the outcome. So if you know the literature on causal inference, this is actually pretty similar to how a cause is defined in the scientific understanding of causality as well, but here it's part of the mental model of how people decide. Now, the crucial part, and this is the link with everything else, is that when we form these counterfactual scenarios to decide what is a cause or not, we form them not in a random manner, but in terms of the normality of the background conditions. So we just consider what is normal. We only change small things, the cause included, and then we make a judgment whether it would make a difference or not. So this normality is understood both in a statistical sense. So we just sample from situations that are statistically more likely, that just happen more often, but also in a prescriptive sense, so in a normative sense. When we make judgments like that, we just sample from situations which are normatively expected. And if there is an aberration, we consider that to be more important. Cannot get what the pattern is every 30 seconds. Something like that. So the conclusion is no. The conclusion is that norms affect whether something is considered a cause or the most important cause or not. And
brother and his other had a TV that maybe something proper.
Which
one is this?
That's something else.
It's yeah, but it's working fine here.
is it?
It was not flickering.
No.
It's
Okay.
flickering, so maybe we need to like.
yeah, that's what I tried to do.
Oh, it's not stable.
Yeah. Anyways, I mean, I hope it's not too distracting.
I can do something else. Let me try that first.
Use that one. Just help us with the online participant.
Do I change it now from here or from here?
You can still switch in yours, I think.
Okay. Right.
Just one thing. Now you should be able to flick it up.
Okay, so there's a very nice citation from a recent study that illustrates the point. So people more frequently select norm violating factor relative to norm conforming ones as the cause of some outcome. To give you just an intuition, imagine that two cars happen to be at an intersection and there is a collision and one goes on red light, the other one goes on green light. So if I ask you which of the car caused the crash, I think most of you will be more likely to say it was the car that went on red. Although, technically speaking, if you think counterfactually, both cars driving into the intersection are necessary for the crash to occur, but we just tend to think that the cause, or the one with higher causal power, is the one that violated the norm, namely passing on red. So the important point here is when we form causal judgment, we tend to basically sample from counterfactual worlds, and we sample based on normality, which is statistical and prescriptive. Something else that I need to introduce before we go on are the different types of causes that we might have. And here we're talking about the causes of events or actual causation and not really general causation as we deal with in science. So productive causes are the simplest ones. These are just when there is direct transfer of energy from one object to the other. So this is how causation works. So in the case of the crash, it will be just the crash, the two cars colliding into each other. In the case of rocket firing and killing the citizens, it's obviously the rocket that hits the citizens and hits them. But there are more interesting examples where, for example, you have the so-called redundant causation. So the example here is you have two rocks that fly towards a bottle. They would both hit the bottle, but then one happens to arrive just a fraction of a second before the other one. So the first rock breaks the bottle, and then the question is, did the second rock break the bottle? Well, maybe not. But if we rephrase the question, did the second rock cause the bottle to be broken? Then it's a little bit more ambiguous, because then we can say if the first one had not broken it, the second one would have. So this makes it difficult to judge what is the causal relationship between the second rock and the bottle. So this is just one example of the difficulties with counterfactual reasoning about causes. Another one is causation by omission, which is very, in a sense, intuitive, but also when you think deeper about it, not so easy to tackle. The example here is maybe there is a plant over there, and it was Honorata's job to water it, and she didn't, and the plant died. So we can think about, Honorata's not watering the plant as the cause of the plant dying. So it's something that did not happen. It's an omission that caused the event. So this is clear. But then you can also say, well, Dimiter not watering the plant also caused the plant to die, because if I had watered it, it would have survived. But I didn't. But somehow we feel that the first example is much more intuitive. It makes more sense than the second one, although technically speaking, in counterfactual terms, her not watering the plant is just the same as me not watering the plant. And the answer to our intuition is, again, we sample from probabilities, from scenarios that are more normal. So since Honorata works here, maybe it's her job, we just think it's more normal than me who only comes like very occasionally. So it's an example of problematic way to think about causes. There's another one about prevention. So for example, I had a silly example related to football. So the goalkeeper caused a win for their team by preventing the striker to score a penalty. And then you have even more complicated situations about double prevention, in which, for example, you have a tackle, a block by a defender who prevented the defender of the opposing team from blocking the striker to score a goal. So is that a cause? In some sense, yes, but it's very difficult. Our intuitions kind of break down when we start to face more complicated scenarios like that. So, to sum up this part, causal judgments are tricky, and they're even more tricky when we have situations of multiple causation, omissions, preventions, double preventions, and such complex causes. All right, enter motivated reasoning. So now I go into the part where I'm sure most of you know more than me about it. So let me just share how I understand it. And I'm going to start with the definition by Dan Kahan. And that is that motivated reasoning is a form of information processing that promotes individuals' interest in forming and maintaining beliefs that signify their loyalty to important affinity groups. Why I like this definition compared to others is that it doesn't make reference to partisans or to political groups, but just any important affinity group. And this is important because in our experiment, we don't refer to partisans, but other affinity groups. So you all know that, but motivated reasoning is a process based on affective processing. And I read some articles that say that there are certain brain circuits and brain regions that fire up when motivated reasoning is involved, hot ones that are different from the cold ones. I'm not in position to judge how credible this literature is, but it's quite interesting that we have these two modes of reasoning, and motivated reasoning is definitely different. So it incorporates confirmation bias and it allows misconceptions to persist, but it also affects the search for information and not only the interpretation of information. So I assume most of you are familiar with that, so I'm just going to go very quickly. Some recent studies that I found that I thought are very interesting is even if people are aware that they're motivated reasoners for moral issues, they actually can recognize that and they persist. So we don't know that we have biases. Sometimes we think, yeah, I'm biased on this topic, and that's actually okay. Now, in politics, motivated reasoning is pervasive. I have just two recent examples to remind ourselves about that. One is a graph, I didn't make that one, about the partisan gap on the economy in the US and whether Democrats and Republicans feel that the economy is doing well. And the point is that when the presidency changes, opinion of the different partisans flips very much. And we could see that also immediately after the election of Trump, a couple of weeks ago, when the evaluations of the economy actually started to move in the expected direction based on partisan motivated reasoning. It's not only the economy, there is a similar graph for crime. So this is the perception of national crime, which also flips very much in line with partisanship. Now, as I said, I'm going very quickly through that because I assume it's common knowledge. The new thing is the synthesis. So the idea is let's bring the literature on causal judgment, which is very interesting, but so far unrelated from motivated reasoning largely, and the literature on motivated reasoning, which to the best of our knowledge has not dealt explicitly with causal judgment questions. And when you bring those together, what is the product? A couple of general hypotheses. The first one is basically motivated reasoning will affect causal judgment and responsibility attribution. And more interestingly, the second one is that we expected that the bias, the gap will be bigger for more difficult causal questions. Why? Because, I mean, these are quite variable anyway. So they're variable in the best of circumstances. So it's actually fairly easy when it's not really clear whether something can be called a cause or not to allow your biases to play a role. So in very general terms, these are the hypotheses that we study. In the context that we studied that, we assume a counter-normative event, which means that this is an event that is normatively bad. And then we assume that when different groups can be blamed for causing this counter-normative event, we're going to tend to blame groups that we don't like, that we don't affiliate with, that we don't identify with, even if everything else about the situation remains the same. Do you have any questions before I move to the empirical part? Yeah.
I do have one. Just wondering, because
Yeah.
I think you're going to speak a little bit more about this. in this case, you're considering that people would consider these potentially two or more groups, both to being causes towards
Yes.
something, right?
Yeah.
Or
Simply put, if something bad happens and there are different groups involved, you're going to consider causally important and responsible the group you don't like, even if the structure of the situation is exactly the same. And then it's going to be easier to do that, not when there is a productive force. When someone directly hits someone and you observe it, it's very hard to say, well, he didn't do it. He was not the cause of it. But if it was causation by omission or by double prevention, then you can just twist your mind and come up with good arguments why actually the guy you prefer was not the cause of what happened, but the guy you don't like or the group you don't like.
and do you think it would be common for people to blame multiple groups other than just focusing on a specific group?
It's an empirical question. That's actually one of the motivations to see when an outcome comes about from the actions of two groups. Does the responsibility and the causal power of one diminish the responsibility and the causal power of the other? So do you kind of weight it equally or not at all? You still just prefer your own guy or own group, and then you blame it all on the other group. So we have some results that speak to that. Of course, it's just one experiment, but I hope I can give some insight on that. So how do we operationalize that in the empirical case? So we developed vignettes in which there is a fight going on between attacking and defending soldiers. So we try to keep as much context out. So we just talk about, I'm going to show the vignette in a second, but it's very shortly described battle between attacking and defending soldiers. And then the attackers fire a rocket which kills civilians, and what we vary is the actions of the defenders. So in one of the vignettes, the defenders just stay in an empty building, and then the attackers fire a rocket that just unintentionally, just by accident, kills civilians. In the second case, the defenders move to a building with civilians, and then the attackers fire a rocket and kill them. And in the third case, the defenders stay put, but the civilians move to them and the defenders fail to move out. So it's kind of this causation by omission or double prevention you can think about. And then the attackers fire a rocket and then kill everyone. So we have three causal scenarios that vary in the status of the causal factor, whether it's direct, omission, double prevention. And then we vary the identity of the soldiers, of the attacking and defending soldiers between Russian and Ukrainian for a total of 6 versions. I hope we have the time to quickly just go through the vignette. They're very short. So for example, A1 is, please imagine the following situation. A Russian platoon fights Ukrainian soldiers in an urban area. The Ukrainian soldiers take shelter in an empty building. The Russian platoon fires a rocket aimed at the Ukrainian soldiers, which misses the target and kills 60 civilians. In the actual vignettes, we didn't color the things. I just put it here for you to see more easily what changes. In the other version, Ukrainian and Russian are flipped. And also here it says that the Russian soldiers take shelter in an empty building. Civilians move to the building, and then the soldiers remain there. So these are 2 of the 6 vignettes that we used. The outcomes that we tracked were, first of all, causal power. So the question is, to what extent do you agree or disagree that either the Russian or the Ukrainian, depending on the version, caused the death of the civilians? So this is a rather standard way in the causal judgment literature to judge causal power. So we borrow it from there. 7-point Likert scales, separate questions for the attackers and for the defenders. We had a similar question about responsibility, which follows the same structure, again, for attackers and defenders. And finally, we had a slider question about distributing the responsibility between the attackers and the defenders. Data comes from an online survey experiment we implemented in Poland on a quarter representative sample with 1,200 respondents. We pre-registered the hypothesis, the designs, the analysis plan, everything, and we implemented some fairly standard quality controls such as attention checks and comprehension checks. So, one important thing, a major assumption of our design is that most Polish people would identify with and support the Ukrainians, which is supported by data, but we don't directly ask about preferences of the people in the conflict because that would have primed them for the purpose of the experiment, so we didn't do it. But I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of Polish people 2 years ago supported Ukraine in the conflict, so it's just an assumption that we make. If anything, the result will be stronger if this assumption is not really true. Okay, results. I hope this graph is actually visible. I thought the screen was going to be a little bit bigger. But now, what we have here is a panel for each causal story. This is the simple one. Here, the soldiers move to civilians. Here, the civilians move to the soldiers. We vary the identity of the attackers. So this is only about responsibility. It's the same about causal power attached to attackers that are either Russian in red or Ukrainian in blue. So the major result is that when the attackers are Russian, they have a lot more ascribed causal power and responsibility than when they're Ukrainians, even though the situation is exactly the same. The difference is huge. It's 2 points on a 7-point scale, so it doesn't get bigger than that. However, it doesn't really vary across the causal stories, as you can see, neither for the Russians nor for the Ukrainians. So the details of the causal structure did not make a difference. However, there is a huge effect about the identity of the attackers. Now you can think this is, well, in retrospect, to be expected, but I'm not sure. Because imagine in this story, basically the Russians fire a rocket towards soldiers that are hiding in a building with civilians, and then they still get exactly the same blame, well, responsibility and causal power, if they would be firing a rocket and just by accident killing civilians. I would have thought that actually the circumstances will make a difference. At least here we see that they don't make a difference at all. Also for the Ukrainians. So mitigating circumstances doesn't really matter. No matter the details, you blame differently based on identity, but not based on the details of the story. It's more interesting to think about how people attribute causal power and responsibility to the defenders, because they do things differently. And here, as you can see, still we have a lot of difference in the attributed power and responsibility, whether the Russians or whether the Ukrainians in blue. And here there are slight differences across the causal stories, but frankly, I thought that these differences, or we thought that these differences would be much bigger. Because when the defenders are Ukrainian and they just go into an empty building, they get almost none of the responsibility and causal power. They get a little bit more, but not that much more when they are the ones moving to civilians. And in a sense, I think you can make quite a strong argument that they're causally responsible for the civilians getting hit, because you go there and then the attackers fire a rocket and they kill the civilians. Doesn't really matter that much. I mean, there is a significant difference statistically, but it doesn't matter that much. And then there is no difference with the third scenario, in which it is the civilians coming to you, which is not really what we hypothesized. At the same time, for the Russian defenders, they get quite a lot of responsibility. Actually, what is interesting is when Russians are the defenders, they get just as much responsibility as when the Ukrainian attackers. So in the vignettes in which Ukraine attacks, Russia defends, civilians are killed, well, the Russians are just as responsible as the Ukrainians, according to the people. I think it's quite fascinating. And there is a difference. They get a bit less responsibility and causal power when they just stay put, civilians come to them, and they fail to move out. Okay, do you have any questions about the set of results that I just presented? There's practically no difference between causal power and responsibility.
No.
I think in the summary, it is pretty much repeating the main point, but for bottom line, huge differences based on identity, very small differences, some of these expected, some of these not expected based on the causal story. So to sum up the results, in accordance with our hypothesis, the causal power and responsibility of the attackers were judged to be significantly higher when the attackers were described as Russian rather than when they were described as Ukrainian. Similarly for defenders, and this was all pre-registered expectations, so far so good. Now, overall, attackers get higher causal power and responsibility than defenders, which is also what is expected. It's also plausible. Although, I mean, in the case in which the attackers fire a rocket in a war and then the defenders hide with civilians, personally, if I didn't know the identity of the two parties, I don't know whom I would blame more. But we just asked, we gave identities, so given identities, defenders always get less of the blame. But then the difference is huge when the attackers are Russian and is very minuscule when they are Ukrainian. It hardly makes a difference there. When it comes to the interactions, well, we don't really get support for the theoretical hypothesis. The differences in causal power and responsibility attribution for attackers are not significant across the three causal scenarios, although I think you can make a good argument why formally the causal power and responsibility is actually different. Now, when it comes to the defending soldiers, they're judged to be more causally efficacious and responsible when they move to a building with civilians than in the baseline scenario, although the effect is fairly small. But then the defending soldiers are judged to be more causally important and responsible in the third scenarios only when they are Ukrainian. And one possible interpretation of that is you hold your own guys to high moral standards, so Ukrainians should have moved out, while you don't really expect that from the Russians. In retrospect, one thing that perhaps we didn't control for is the identity of the citizens that get killed. And our intention was people to assume that the citizens are part of the defenders, but maybe people didn't assume that and they transposed their thinking to the actual war in Ukraine and they thought the citizens are Ukrainian, so you blame the Russians no matter what the defenders do because these are Ukrainian citizens, and then you expect the Ukrainian defenders to move away from Ukrainian citizens, but not the Russians. But again, this is actually in line with this logic that you just sample from counterfactual scenarios that are normal. So it's normal for Ukrainians to protect Ukrainian citizens, but it's not expected, it's not normal for Russians to do so. Therefore, you don't blame them more than in other cases. So fairly complex pattern of results. Well, what this means, I think in our scenarios, it's pretty clear that politically motivated reasoning had huge effects on causal judgments and responsibility assignment. If anything, this is a huge win for motivated reasoning because it kind of overwhelms everything. So I don't expect you would disagree with that, but who knows? The effect of motivated reasoning is actually so big that it crowds out or it overwhelms any potential effects of causal structure, which I think from a scientific point of view are the more interesting ones, but there's no clear evidence that they are there in the presence of motivated reasoning. And then there is this intriguing suggestion, this hypothesis that moral expectations can inform causal judgments in a way that it makes it harder for the in-group, for the group that we prefer, to be judged less responsible because we just expect more from them in certain situations. But this is speculative, it's something for further research. Now, these are the conclusions of this first study on the topic that we concluded, and part of my motivation for doing the presentation today is to also just solicit ideas or to see what are interesting directions to move this further. Some of the ideas we have been discussing and playing with is, first of all, I mean, it seems fairly straightforward to extend that to other conflicts that are polarized in a sense that people have different ideas and then also somehow measure.
Dimiter, should we go to the Q&A?
Yeah, just.
We only have 20 minutes left.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Just let me finish the sentence. So one way, different conflicts. Easily we can do that. Another idea, just strip away any context and just say these billiard balls are yours, these billiard balls are the others. Do people are going to still reproduce motivated reasoning in these conditions? And then, I mean, there's so many scenarios in which political outcomes, policymaking outcomes could depend on these kind of processes. So perhaps we should move towards studying those. So thank you very much and looking forward to the Q&A indeed.
Responsible for the discussion.
Let me just,
Would you go back to the slide?
yeah, sure. Which one? Yep.
Okay, we start with Gustavo, Enzo, Jakob, and then I take the further run.
I put it here, but
Oh yeah, you have to now share it again, I think.
oh.
Yeah. Then one that is already open, so this one, yes. Okay. Yeah, thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting, and it's also aligned with a lot of the stuff that I've been reading for my own work. And I was thinking of how kind of connects to what you also mentioned during the results and conclusion, that if there is an assumption, I kind of connect this whole attribution of causes and responsibility to agency as well, so that even if two objects are part of an action such as crashing, the one that made the decision or is the one that is counter-normative is the one that is attributed the most blame, responsibility, and cause. But I also see it from an agency perspective where, for example, if there's a war, the attacker is usually the one that also chose to enter the war, while the other one had the war imposed upon them, right? So they had little agency in what's actually going on. They can choose to stop the war other ways, but the assumption is that normally countries will not simply surrender, right? They will try to fight back. So in reality, they don't really have much of an agency, while the attacker maybe had multiple different paths. And then I thought of how, connecting to what you said, if one party is associated or one group is associated to be the attacker, then it's almost like everything that is happening against them, and therefore the causes are almost always attributed to that group. So I think it's interesting to see how people's like versus dislike or affect towards these different groups may be in line or not in line with people's perceptions of who started the process. Because maybe you could not really dislike Russians necessarily, but still think that they're to be blamed for all of this since they started it.
Yeah.
That's one thing. And then I also was thinking, you don't have neutral vignettes here where you don't have like groups that are unrelated or unknown, right?
Yes.
I was wondering if sometimes you have ceiling effects for the Russians, for example.
Yeah.
While maybe for the other groups you might have these different gradients, but still the results I think are quite interesting.
You're taking notes, right? Okay. Thank you very much, because I cannot.
Yeah, no, super interesting and relieved, because, you know, motivated me myself, and I was always worried. But yeah, no, it's what we would expect. But well, some of the stuff has just been covered by Gustavo, I think. But one thing that I would like to say, so there's something between the two things. There's something between trying the billiard balls, and you could also just have the war scenario by just calling blips and globes.
Yeah.
And I think that you would have a graduated version with that.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so I think it would be interesting to see. But I wanted to ask you, if you have a split between the cause and the responsibility data, do you see any difference there? Because that could be something, right?
Yeah.
If you
that's another hypothesis that we actually pre-registered,
Right.
and there's no difference whatsoever.
No difference
You
whatsoever.
could just
But
look at the other, and the patterns are the same, and the levels are the same.
This is quite normal in my experience teaching students, that when you explain to them the basic distinction between moral and causal responsibility, it's often like a light bulb moment for them.
Yeah.
But that suggests that your comprehension test at the beginning was very lenient.
Yeah.
Because you would want to, you see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Because I know it's super basic, but in undergraduates, normally you have to really go, causal responsibility versus moral responsibility. Right, and but which means
No, I don't
think
disagree.
If you want to see that, I think your comprehension test needs to be more hardcore.
Yeah.
Because that's what I would expect, that people, in fact.
Yeah. Let me answer some of that, because I'll forget. Indeed, these two are much more highly correlated than we expected. It could be also an artifact of the way we asked the question, because they have the same answer formats and they came on separate pages, but still. And I think it will be different if we ask for blame, because there is a difference between responsibility and blame. And responsibility is much closer to causal power, but then blame has at least one or perhaps more steps removed from responsibility. And here is actually when the intentions and the agency part comes in, because there's research that said that also we are more likely to attribute causal power when the agent when the action is intentional. So even if it's exactly the same type of situation, if they did it on purpose, we would say that they have more causal power, more responsibility, and also more blame. So in the first vignette, we said that the attackers killed the civilians by accident because we had to say something, and precisely for the reason that we didn't want to imply agency in any of the circumstances, we didn't mention it, but it certainly plays a role in this whole thing. I think the idea that attackers are always to blame because defenders have to defend anyways, it's very interesting, and I relate to that. At the same time, if we look at the results, when the attackers are Ukrainian, there is hardly any difference between defenders and attackers. So I don't have the direct contrast on the graph, but if you compare the blue lines here with the red lines here, they're almost exactly the same. So either respondents assumed that the fictional conflict that we introduced is the real conflict in which Russia is definitely the aggressor and Ukraine has no other choice but to defend. We didn't want to imply that, but I mean, again, you cannot control what people associate with the vignettes. And if we made it even more abstract, I'm not sure that you could actually signal the identities that you want. So these glips and globs, yeah, sure, but I mean, how do you make certain that these motivated reasoning paths are fired because people start being attached to the glips and not to the globs? I mean, there are probably ways to do that, but it's very different than the survey experiment that we did.
But it would be good just to have a baseline.
Yes, no, absolutely, yeah, because then you know, yeah.
And on the stuff of, I agree on the blame stuff. That actually was my next thought. But there's some X5 results already on, there are these things these studies that go against the auto implies can things where they move the starting conditions and then you get different results. And so I think that's kind of it becomes your literature, which is interesting.
In the paper there's a bit of reference to that, but I'm sure that we can think more about how it's relevant.
The baseline for the same sample would be good.
No, it makes a lot of sense.
I would just repeat because I also was wondering, does the causal structure of the overall context or conflict that people imagine just overshadow the differences between the scenarios? And is it then in-group affinity that is really leading to this motivated reasoning, or is it just a question of people already think who's responsible for the larger conflict, like for the overall conflict? And maybe one way could be to find some sort of like more ambiguous situation as essentially like who's responsible for the conflict itself, or kind of like manipulate who's responsible for the conflict itself, and then on a like lower level have different scenarios of what happens and see this causal structures within those scenarios then still play a role above and beyond this overall conflict question.
So would, for example, the conflict in the Middle East, Israel-Palestine work? Because I mean, here I think it's quite, you can have different opinions, definitely, and people do have different opinions. The only complication is that you have to ask about that in the beginning, and then you prime these attitudes in the very beginning, and then perhaps people feel committed to, I just said that I support the Palestinians, so therefore there's no way I'm going to blame Israel or say that Israel is not responsible for any of the things in any of the scenarios. But if we can find a smart way in which we can proxy for who would you support for the conflict without asking directly, and then see if people really, although now that I have seen these results, sorry, I wanted to go to this. Now that I've seen this result, I would expect that, again, nothing about the causal structure will matter. So if I think about, did it matter that when Israel hit hospitals, they claim with video sometimes more or less credibly that terrorists were hiding there? I think it actually makes no difference. If you already support Palestinians, first of all, you're not going to look into these arguments, motivated search for information. You're not going to believe them, and nothing about the justifications will change your mind. Similarly, if you're on the Israeli side, I mean, whether there were civilians there or not, it's war. You have to do what you have to do. So, I mean, quite disturbingly, the big lesson for me here is that people can basically twist their minds and arguments to fit their preferred conclusions about who is responsible and who is to blame in any situation. The details don't really matter that much.
Okay, briefly.
Do you think the conflation would also be if you just switch those parts? So just after all the scenarios, ask them who do you think is responsible for like the broader conflict? Because I think this is more of an opinion that shouldn't be influenced too much by having those specific scenarios first.
Yeah.
Just switch the order.
Yeah, we'll think about that definitely. Yeah, thanks.
Yes, you've been waiting long.
Yeah, no, I have something quite similar to say, but which I think is slightly different. Which is I had the same thought that maybe you could ask it after, like what people's stances are on the conflict are. Because also I expect that your results would also have been different if you had asked people in Russia as well, because I mean, typically in conflicts, the aggressor doesn't think that they're an aggressor, they think that they're defending people. So in this case, Russia thought they were defending Russian Ukrainians.
Yeah.
And with Israel, Palestine, you would have, I expect the same findings where Israelis would consider October 7th to be the aggression, sort of the conflict. Palestinians would see a lot more that's sort of the aggression. So I think looking at this polarization could be really interesting. Another thing I was thinking of was how it was presented now. It seemed almost as if first the causal scenario is considered and then responsibility is assigned. And what you hinted at here was that actually responsibility is assigned first before the causal scenario is considered. With also what you were just mentioning about how people don't care to look into the facts.
Yeah.
So it might actually just show that actually, also when you were presenting the levels of complexity of causal relationships, I was thinking, like in so many political scenarios, people will jump through so many reasoning hoops to still assign blame. So if they're able to account for such complexity, just still assign the same party blame that they want to assign blame. So it also, I don't know if it's possible to study that order, but yeah.
No, absolutely. And there's literature to that. That was one of the insights reading this causal judgment literature. I think the folk theory is that you base your judgment about the causal structure of the problem. Based on that, you base judgments about responsibility. Based on that, combining intentions, you assign blame, and then you decide who to punish, which is something else I work on. But then it turns out that indeed it's sometimes the other way around. So first you have you have made up your mind about who is to blame, and then based on that you adjust how you see the causal structure. And there are some empirical studies to that effect as well. I think ours is actually quite compatible with that. But I think that's actually quite, I would think this is interesting and not necessarily new because there is literature in it, but at least in political science still this folk view in which, well, people first consider causes, effects, and then they move more or less rationally, perhaps a little biased, but rationally towards judgments of blame and punishment. Yeah, it's for at least hot issues like that, it's not really the case. But it's also not the case for more trivial ones. I would want to know that.
Thanks. First, about the prize you won. I really like the graphs, but I really love the emoji. The mind-blowing one.
Yeah, thanks.
But my question is about, so what you're showing, it's clear that it is about bias processing, right?
Yeah.
But I was wondering, and I'm really not sure myself, if this is about motivated reasoning as well. Because I was wondering, so the way I always understand that literature is that it is about priors and about how you deal with information that is not congruent with your own ideas, right? So that can be congruent or not congruent. It can be about whether or not you look for information that is congruent or not. But I'm not really sure whether that is what you're doing here. It is, of course, about normative values you have, ideas about what is good, what is wrong.
and the interaction with a message you get.
Mhm.
But is that really about that? And I'm also,
Yeah.
I'm struggling with that a little bit. I'm not really sure if that is the same as what I described before. But maybe I'm also wrong, right? So maybe motivated reasoning is the broader concept and bias processing is part of that, or is bias processing the bigger thing and motivated reasoning just one specific example of that? So that would be my question. Is it really about motivated reasoning?
Okay, so let me try to persuade you that it is, because it's a crucial point if we want to sell the project as one about motivated reasoning. So the conclusion you want to reach here is that your guys do the good thing, or they don't do the bad thing. So this is the conclusion that you want your reasoning to lead you to, and then you twist the causal structure in order to make it fit with the pre-existing conclusion that the Ukrainians are the good guys, no matter what they do. So the motivated reasoning aspect comes into reaching the conclusions via bias in how you process the information. And we show the bias because if it's about Russians, you think about one way. If it's the same information about Ukrainians, you think it in another way. So that's why I started with this motivation that, with this definition that motivated reasoning can be about support for any affinity group. So it doesn't need to be about ideology, it doesn't need to be about partisanship, but it's really more general, as you say, just trying to reach conclusions before you consider the facts. So consider the facts in order to reach the conclusion. In this case, because we keep the outcome that it's something bad, obviously bad for anyone, there can be no doubt about it. Nobody would agree that killing civilians is good. Then the motivated part comes into you don't want Ukrainians to be responsible for something bad, and then the rest of the story follows.
There's me a bit more.
Okay, so we should try to do that. Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know.
Oh, yeah, I'm new. Maybe wrong. Thanks for the presentation. Just a quick comment, because I was thinking something similar to your second point in this future research slide. Just a very pure test of the mechanism. Because as far as I understood it, the different scenarios are supposed to reflect ever more indirect types of causation. Right. Yeah. And I think the development makes a lot of sense. I think that's very interesting to be tested. If it hasn't been tested, then I think even billiard balls would be interesting. But I understand that you want to apply to a context. I was just wondering whether that was registered as such in the respondents' minds. If they actually saw these types of scenarios are as more indirect or as more complex. Yeah. Because of the examples that you gave, for instance, of bombing a hospital and all, that's very clear. The examples you gave before as well, that's very clear to me. That's very indirect. But the scenarios that you actually showed, so personally, I didn't really understand, civilians moved back into the building. So I guess my point is that maybe the treatment wasn't strong enough to test this mechanism per se, especially in this context. So I would suggest making even clearer that the causation is indirect. So maybe more, easier for the respondents to note and register that it is more indirect. Yeah.
No, good point. I don't disagree. The question is how you can do that because without leading them too much. The comprehension questions that we asked did not have to do with the causal details of the story. It was about who were the attackers and about whether civilians were killed at all. Because we thought if we would also ask about the causal details, then we're leading them too much to considering. I think even if what you say is true, it's going to be the same when people watch the news, right? So do they really register details? Perhaps a little bit more than if they just glance through a vignette fairly quickly. But in a sense, you could consider that as part of the mechanism. So when you know who is good and who is bad, and who is responsible and who is not responsible, you're not even going to consider the details that much. That being said, for other experiments, we have to consider indeed how to make it more salient what the actual causal details of the story are.
I have two more questions. If they are very brief, with brief answers, we can cover them in 2 minutes. Guys, and then Gustavo.
Okay. Can be challenging. I will just give a suggestion that is still actually looking into, although I missed half of the results, so maybe you did this and I make flow. So my suggestion is to look in some of the dependent variables that Tabor and Lodge used to argue about reasoning. So to think about how long were people reading this? Can they list arguments for different standpoints? Or can you get them to read more or something like that? I think then it will get a bit closer to the reasoning part of motivated reasoning and a little bit away from what you currently do, which is, I guess, motivated outcomes.
That was my part of what I was gonna say. I was gonna say what we see in terms of results is motivated behavior, motivated outcomes. And that first there's motivated reasoning, that there might be something like motivated update of beliefs, or in this case, causal judgments, and then motivated outcomes or motivated behavior. But of course, everybody just calls it motivated reasoning because that's what I guess the underlying idea is. But basically the entire point. But one thing that I thought is, if you wanted to move beyond conflict and you want to look to parties, you can look at like economic policies.
Yeah.
And then you can do somewhat what Jakob also suggested, which is to have these underlying cause for the entire thing, like saying this party passed this policy or this law way long ago, but then the other parties did this and this party did this in each mandate. And then you can kind of in a similar fashion, you can see how they modify their causal judgments.
Okay, no time for an answer. Great suggestions. Thank you very much. Well, first and we get your
Yay.
coffee.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you very much.